on DoDash, what we're here, and then it goes off. So let me know when you can see the screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Fantastic. Well, great to have you guys all here in the session. I'm very happy today for this wonderful input with you today, Dhruv, talking about your book, what you just launched now, and about talking about funding your own startup. But before we start, I would like to give some short words about DoDash, just very quickly, so you know who we are and what all this is about. So with DoDash, we are working on bringing together founders, investors, experts, people from the global startup ecosystem to really help founders to understand how does the funding process work, how do I get to investors, and how do I actually succeed in the due diligence process. So we are building a platform, a community for that, so you can exchange, you can learn from each other, and that is what DoDash is all about. And as part of that, we do regular sessions like this one. So how can the DoDash community currently help you? So right now with DoDash, you can exchange with people locally in your city. You are able to join events like these, learn from experts like Dhruv Nath and from others. You can validate your business ideas. You're able also to be part of accelerator programs, incubators. You can also check your investment readiness. Where are you with your business right now? You can get exclusive benefits such as startup credits and more. And these are just like a short view of the things that we can offer you as DoDash right now. So one thing I would definitely recommend all of you, if you're building a business, if you're right now on the path of creating a startup, you need to know, are you investor ready or not? So we created something we call the DoDash Investment Readiness Check, where we for free will check, is your startup investor ready, yes or not? And if it is, we're happy to forward you to people in our investor network and see if you're the right fit for them. And you can also get up to $25,000 in startup credits from partners such as HubSpot, Freshworks, and AWS Activate. An important part of what we do as DoDash are our founder sparing links, the local communities that we have in places like Cologne, Dubai, Delhi, and more. So places where you can exchange with other founders, with experts. So on DoDash, you can check which community is closest to you, and I would recommend to you become a part of that. So these are just some quick information on DoDash before we kick this off. I'm Michal Kozak. I'm the head of global community at DoDash. And if you want to learn more, I'm happy to talk to you. Just reach out to me on DoDash, and I'm happy to answer all your questions. Then, now let's come to the main part. Our speaker, Dhruv Nath, I want to introduce him and what he does. Dhruv Nath is a professor at the Management Development Institute, the MDA, in Gurgaon, India. He is a director with Lead Angels, one of the leading angel networks in India. He is also an active angel investor himself. So for interesting startup ideas, he's always happy to have a look if it fits or not. He is also a former vice president of NIIT Ltd, a big outsourcing company in India, very successful what they're doing. He has been a consultant with famous companies such as Gillette, Nestle, Thermax, and many more. And of course, he is a multiple times author, such of a book we're going to discuss today, which is Funding Your Startup and Other Nightmares. And with that, I would give it to you, Dhruv, and happy to have you here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much. So, hi, everyone. I assume you guys are from all over the world. I know there's one person from Ahmedabad, there's one person from Ireland, and I'm assuming you're from all over. So welcome to this. So what I'll just do is I will start by sharing my screen, and I assume we can see it. Yeah, Michael? Okay, great. So, I've been having a chat with Michael and his partner for a couple of months now, and he suggested that we take this seminar. I'll explain to you what this is all about. For the last 6-7 years, I have spent a lot of time with founders of startups, right? Mainly in India, but also some of them who are out of India, Singapore, US. And what we have realized is that when you create a startup, many people who've created the startup, many founders actually fail, both in creating the startup, building the startup, and in getting funding. Many people fail, but conversely, some people also succeed. And what we realized was that it's actually important for founders to understand what are the factors which are likely to lead to success and what are the factors which are likely to lead to failure, right? And that's the reason why we actually wrote this book. And you can see this book here. It's called Funding Your Startup and Other Nightmares. Uh, you can see it's written by me and my co-author Sushanto Mitra. And this book actually has a lot of stories about successes as well as failures. And I think the most important thing here is that we have tried to create a framework within which you can evaluate your startup to see whether it is A, likely to succeed or not, and B, whether you are fundable or not, right? Of course, very, very important. You must remember there is no guarantee. The fact that you follow this framework does not necessarily mean you'll succeed, but your chances of succeeding are obviously brighter. So that's the book. Incidentally, it's available on both Amazon and in case you're in India, it's available on Flipkart. And the Kindle version is also available in case you want to download it, right? So what I will share with you today is really one story from the book, and I will then share the framework that we have talked about and how that story fits into this framework, right? At the end, we will try and look at what investors look for, because ultimately, if you're creating a startup, at some stage you may want funding. So what is it that investors look for, and therefore how do you make sure that your startup is more fundable, right? So that's the plan for tonight. Okay, so um, the case I'm taking, the story I'm talking about is, it's actually a case which is based in India, but it can apply to anywhere in the world, number one. Number two, the framework that I'm talking about applies to any country, right? So it's a common framework, except that I'm taking the case from India. So this is a company called AHA Taxis. It's a very interesting company. And, they were focusing on taxis for outstation travel. See, you have things like Uber, right, which take you within the city. So if you're in Berlin, it'll take you within Berlin. If you're in London, it'll take you within London. This is outstation travel. If you want to travel, let's say, if you want a taxi from London to Edinburgh, right, or from Delhi to Lucknow, which is two cities in India, right? So they focused on outstation taxis, and basically what they were focusing on was one-way taxis, right? And obviously, you would require a one-way taxi in some cases where, for example, you don't know what your return journey is and you don't want to hang on to the taxi for those many days, because then you're paying for the taxi, right? Or you've got train tickets in one direction and you haven't been able to get train tickets in the other direction, and therefore you want a taxi one way, only one way. So these guys worked on what we call one-way taxis. Now, there is a fundamental problem, and this is a problem across the world, by the way. It's not an Indian problem. There's a fundamental problem with one-way taxis. And let me explain what that problem is. I'll again take the example of two Indian cities, but it applies to anywhere in the world. So the problem is every such taxi, every such outstation taxi has a base city, right? So for example, a taxi in Delhi is based in Delhi, and you can take this taxi from Delhi. But the problem is, this taxi you cannot take from another city, right? Which means, suppose you've taken a one-way taxi from Delhi to, let us say, Jaipur. Jaipur is another city in India, right? You've taken a one-way taxi, you've taken a taxi from Delhi to Jaipur. Now, when in Jaipur, the taxi is not able to get return fare, right? Which means he comes back empty. So you are taking the taxi only from Delhi to Jaipur, which is one way, but that poor guy on the way back is returning empty. So what he will tell you is, boss, not acceptable. Even if you want to go one way, I am going to charge you two-way fare, right? So that is the fundamental problem that you're trying to solve. which is you want to take a one-way taxi, but taxis are only willing to charge two-way fare, even if you want to travel only one. So now, how did our taxis solve this problem? So what they did was, they said, we will onboard a lot of taxi operators, which could be individual taxis as well as guys who own maybe a fleet of 5, 10, 20, 30 taxis. And they said, now we can communicate with these guys wherever they are. All right. So if the taxi has gone from Delhi to Jaipur and has taken a one-way passenger and dropped him off at Jaipur, on the way back, AHA taxis can give him a passenger who wants to come from Jaipur to Delhi, right? Which means now, because of the fact that the taxi is partnering with AHA taxis, the company I'm talking about, he is able to get a passenger on both, in both directions, Delhi to Jaipur as well as Jaipur to Delhi. So which means what he will now say is, if you want to travel one way, I will only charge you one way fare. Don't worry, because I know I will get a passenger on the way back. And our taxis added a commission, which is typically 10 to 15%, and charge the customer one way fare plus 15%. All right. So that's the way the model worked. Now, let me just explain the process that they followed. And by the way, I'm talking about the process as it was when they started. And they started about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I will then take you through the process, through what happened over the years. So the process is, the customer asks for a booking. Just as you want to book an Uber cab, you will normally go to your app or you'll go to the website and you'll book an Uber, right? Now, AHA Taxi gives them a fare which is based on past data, right? And the customer does the booking. So he's booked the taxi, the one-way taxi, but he still doesn't know which taxi it is. Even AHA Taxis does not know which taxi it is. Now what they do is, they manually check with possible operators, right? The possible operators who are operating in that region. So for example, when I talk about Delhi to Jaipur, they will look at taxi operators who are in this region, that is North India, right? And they will speak to them on the phone, they will send them an SMS, they will look for responses. Based on whatever discussions they've had, they will allocate a taxi, right? So the customer has now got his taxi. And the rates obviously could vary depending on the season. For example, in India, Diwali season, it becomes more expensive. In the West, Christmas time would become more expensive, right? So this is the process. But please remember, this is a fully manual process. Every time the customer makes a booking, our taxis has to physically phone up or send an SMS and do the allocation of the taxi. Okay, now what I'll get into is the framework that I spoke about. Right? And the framework I spoke about, which actually is part of this book, is what I call persistent. Right? And this is an acronym, which means each letter in this word persistent stands for something. And that something is what the startup needs to ensure. So let's start with the first letter, which is P. Okay. And P stands for problem. Are you solving a problem for the customer? Okay. Now, this is very important, because if you're not solving a problem for the customer, no customer is going to pay you. And if he doesn't pay you, obviously you don't have a business. Therefore, problem is the first thing any founder needs to look at. And here, clearly, they were solving a problem, because you had a lot of passengers who were trying to travel one way, but they were forced to pay two-way. So they wanted to cut down their cost, and that's a problem this company was trying to solve. Next issue is what we call earnings model. And earnings model actually means two things. But for the purpose of this session, I'll talk about one, which is, are you actually going to earn some money out of it? Is there a revenue model, right? Will the customer pay you? You may be solving a problem, but will he pay you for solving this problem? If he doesn't, once again, you don't have a viable business, right? So clearly there was an earnings model here, because AHA Taxis was charging a commission of 10 to 15% over and above what the cab operator was charging him. All right. So he had an earnings model. Third, what is the size of the market? Right? Now, here you must appreciate one thing, and I assume Most of you guys who are on this webinar, you guys are founders or you want to create startups. And you must remember one thing, it's very important. You don't want to create a startup which, remains tiny, remains small, stagnates, doesn't grow at all. It doesn't make sense, isn't it? You don't want a startup where, you say, sorry, I don't want to earn more than $10,000 in a year. I'm very happy with that. No, you want a startup that grows and grows and grows even more, right? Ultimately, it should become maybe, $500,000, $1 million, 2 million, 6 million, or in the Indian currency, 1 crore, 5 crores, 10 crores, right? You want a startup that grows. Now, obviously, if you want to have a startup that grows, you must be in a market which itself is large in size. Because a market which is small in size, you cannot grow, right? Now, if you look at AHA Taxis, clearly the market size is huge because the Indian market is about 1.3 billion people, 130 crore people, and that's a huge market. And lots of them travel outstation, and lots of them want to take one-way taxis. So it's a very huge market that these guys are operating. There is no problem. Okay. Next is the question of what we call scalability. Again, very, very important. You may be operating in a very large market. So size of the market may be large, but you need to be able to scale up rapidly within that market. Otherwise, the other guy, your competitor, potentially can scale up faster than you and get into your business and maybe kill you. All right. So it's very, very important if you have a startup to have a model, a business model, which is rapidly scalable, where you can scale up fast. If you look at AHA Taxis, right, and let's analyze AHA Taxis from the scalability angle. Clearly, if you go back to the process, every time a customer wanted a taxi, AHA Taxis would phone up or SMS the likely taxi operators, right? That's a manual process. And manual processes normally are not very scalable. Why? Very simple. Suppose you want to grow, you want to double in size, you'll have to double the number of people you have because you have to double the number of phone calls and the SMSs you send. You want to quadruple in size, you have to add that many more people. You have to add that much more infrastructure, that much more PCs, phone lines, etc., etc., etc. Right? So anything which has a lot of manual involvement normally is low on scalability, and therefore AHA Taxis, when it started, was low in scalability. What these guys did, interestingly, and they took 2 years to do this, was they then made it scalable. They said, we will create an app and we'll get every taxi operator to download this app, right? Just as you do in the case of Uber. Every taxi driver has the Uber app. So now these guys are able to communicate on the app, not manually but automatically. So every time the customer books a taxi, a message automatically is sent out to all these apps in the for the taxis who operate in that area, and the taxis then bid for the ride. Okay, so it's a little more than Uber. It's similar to Uber, but you actually have a formal bidding system, and automatically the software then figures out which the best option is, which the lowest cost option is, and it allocates that taxi to the that particular customer. So please remember, this is entirely automated. It's a digital business now, right? And digital businesses are much more scalable than manual businesses. Okay, so they became far more scalable because of this app that they had created. And that's, by the way, that's advice to you guys. Whatever startup you guys are planning, as long as you have a product, or as long as you have something which is largely digital, right, your scalability is going to be very high. The more the manual involvement, the tougher it is for you to scale. And incidentally, the tougher it is going to be for you to get an investor to fund your business, because he also wants scalable businesses. Okay, so we have looked at the first four, and you will notice that I'm taking letters out of this word persistent, right? So PESS, right? Next, I will take the next three letters, which is R, I, and E. Extremely important. So what is R? R stands for risk. Every business potentially has a risk, right? So for example, in the case of our taxis, the risk is if Uber says one-way intercity taxis is a great business to be in, Uber gets in and they can potentially kill our taxis, isn't it? Because Uber is a worldwide market leader. Okay, so that's a huge risk. So if you are in any whatever business you are in, you have to make sure that you are able to take care of your risk. And one of the risks you always have, which is the case with Uber in this case, one of the risks you always have is the potential for a competitor to enter and kill you, right? And that is why you need something that we call an entry barrier. Okay, and that is the E, the first E in the word persistent. It stands, sorry, the second E in the word persistent. So entry barrier is what? In the business, you have created something. Your business model is such that you will create a barrier for the other guy who wants to enter your business. Okay, explaining it a little differently, some of you may be familiar with the term moat, M-O-A-T, right? If you remember, castles, wherever they are, whether they are in Europe, whether they are in India, wherever they are, castles normally have a large amount of water, a pool of water around them, right? And the reason for that was if an enemy wanted to enter the castle, they could not cross that water, right? And that water was called a moat. So the moat is something which prevents the other guy from entering. Similarly here, an entry barrier is something which prevents your competitor from potentially getting into your business, competing with you, maybe at lower prices and therefore killing you, right? And of course, by the way, one of the popular, one of the common methods of building an entry barrier is to have a highly innovative solution, which is not copyable. For example, if you have a patent, right, then obviously that is a very good entry barrier because the other guy cannot copy it because he's violating the law and you can sue him. So innovative solutions obviously are very, very good entry barriers. So just look at our taxis. We'll once again analyze our taxis. Initially, the entry barrier was low because actually anybody could get into this business, right? Actually, anybody can get it. Anybody can say, look, I will have, let's say 50 taxi operators and I will compete. Okay. Over time, what happened was the app-based bidding system became some kind of barrier because the competitor potentially would have to create a similar app and that would take him maybe 3 to 4 months. So he needs at least 3 to 4 months to catch up with our taxis. Okay. So that became a bit of an entry barrier. Now, very, very important, with scaling up, the number of taxis became an entry barrier. Incidentally, when he started, he had about 10 taxis. Today, he's got about 40,000 taxis. Okay. And that's a very, very important entry barrier. You know why? Because let us say you want to travel from, I will take let's say two towns. I'll take two towns in India, right? Suppose you want to travel from Nagpur to Raipur, right? These are two towns in central India. It could be any two towns anyway. It could be Cologne to maybe Stuttgart, right? Is that a correct example, Michael? Cologne to Stuttgart taxi?
It's fine, yeah. And well, it's a bit like it's a bit far, but
okay.
let's say maybe yeah, Cologne Düsseldorf I think works better. It's not too far away, but yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, great. So, the problem is, so now let's say you want to travel from Nagpur to Raipur, which I told you. The customer, the potential passenger wants a taxi on the 15th of November at 10 a.m. in the morning, right? If you have only a very small number of taxis, there is a good chance that you will not be able to provide a customer a taxi on that day because they're all busy. But if you have 40,000 taxis, there is a very good chance you will have some taxi which is free and therefore that guy is willing to take the passenger. So the chances of ensuring that you actually have a taxi available for the customer for the journey that he wants to take on the date and time that he wants is much higher if the number of taxis is high. Okay, that's an entry barrier because your competitor potentially has to have a very large number of taxis to be able to ensure the same level of service, right? To be able to ensure that a taxi is available for this trip. And obviously, it will take him so much more time to get so many taxis, right? So the size actually becomes a very major entry barrier. And of course, brand, brand trust obviously becomes a very huge entry barrier. I'll just take a very simple example. All of you have Coca-Cola, right? Coke. Now, if somebody else comes up with a drink which has exactly the same taste, but a different brand, suppose they call it, let us say, new drink, you still wouldn't take it because you don't trust it. You don't know it. Coke, you've tried it before, it's good. This one, you have no clue, right? So you probably wouldn't take it. Brand is very, very important. And therefore, the brand in the case of our taxis would become a barrier. And generally, if you look at all these things, the app-based bidding system coming up, scaling up happening, number of taxis going up, brand building up, entry barrier normally builds up over time. So when you start, very often you don't have enough of an entry barrier. But as you grow, typically your entry barrier, your moat tends to become stronger and stronger. But please remember one thing, extremely important. Uh, there is no such thing as a foolproof entry barrier. And there is no such thing as a permanent entry barrier because your competitor is always trying to compete with you. So you always have to stay ahead, which means your entry barrier has to keep improving with time. Okay, so far we have looked at all these, and you'll notice that these are part of the persistent framework. Uh, the next thing is, what do you do if the market is crowded, right? Now, I'll tell you what happens in the Indian market. In the case of our taxis, if you want outstation taxis, it's a very, very crowded market because in each colony, in each neighborhood, for example, in my neighborhood, I live in Delhi. In my neighborhood, there are at least about 7 or 8 different taxi stands, and you can take an outstation taxi from there. So it's a very crowded market. And when you have a very crowded market, it is extremely difficult to build up to a point where you differentiate yourselves from the other guys. But the one-way taxi market is not crowded because no taxi operator wants to give you a one-way taxi and charge one way. So what our taxis decided was, within this highly crowded outstation taxi market, I will choose a subset which is not crowded, and I will call that subset a niche. But of course, it has to be a large enough niche, right? So they very clearly identified a large enough niche, which is the one-way taxi market rather than the two-way taxi market. Two more things. One is what we call traction, right? You may have a brilliant business model, great size of the market, highly innovative solution, very highly scalable, entry barrier, very strong. But the ultimate proof is, are you getting customers? Are you getting customers? Are they willing to pay you? Are your customers increasing month on month on month? Are the customers increasing quarter on quarter? That is what we call traction. Right? And that's extremely important because that is the ultimate proof of your business model working. Okay? And finally, probably the most important of all, finally, is something that we call team. Okay, which means what? The team starts with the founder or the two or three co-founders, right? And this is exceptionally important, extremely important, because if you have the wrong team, the wrong founders, it doesn't matter how good a business you have, you'll flounder, you'll sink. But if you have a strong team, even if you have a business model which is not the greatest, not the best, chances are the founders will make sure that you actually are able to overcome the problems and move ahead. Okay, so this is our persistent framework, PERSISTENT, right? And we have found in our experience, so my experience is about 6-7 years, and my co-founder, his experience with startups has been about 20-25 years. Our experience has been that all successful startups, by and large, follow this kind of framework, even though they don't know it. And the failures have something or the other missing, right? For example, maybe they don't have an entry barrier, or they don't have a large enough market size, or they don't have a scalable model, or the risks are too high. One of them is a problem. So that's the persistent framework. I just want to mention two important things. One is, I've talked about this as a framework, but please remember, persistent is not just a framework, it is also an English word. And sorry, let me just switch off my phone. Just give me a minute. Yeah. So persistent is also an English word, right? And persistence means what? You got to keep on and on and on at it, right? You can't give up. You have to keep on at it. And you must remember, if you have a startup, you will have a lot of ups and downs. You'll probably have more downs than ups. For example, this entire COVID crisis that has taken place across the world, it's a huge down. People are in deep trouble. You will have downs like this. May not be such massive downs, but many, many downs you will have. You've just got to keep on and on and on and persevere. You got to be persistent. And if you're not persistent, becoming an entrepreneur, creating a startup is not for you. Then you take up a nice job. Maybe take up a very comfortable professor's job like me, right? Don't become a startup founder. Okay. So that's persistent. And by the way, these guys, very interestingly, just to share with you the R Taxi story, they were rejected by our angel network. We are part of an angel network. They were rejected. We said, no, we will not fund you. They didn't give up. They went to another angel network. They grew. They came back to us, and now we funded them. So they kept on and on at it. And this time they actually got funded at a higher valuation. All right. So being persistent is extremely important. Finally, I've talked about what a successful startup needs to be. Now, the other question is, what do investors look for? And actually, if you think about it, what they look for is exactly what the startup looks for, right? A persistent startup, isn't it? Because, the investor and the founders, they want exactly the same thing. They want the startup to grow. They want the startup to become profitable. They want it to succeed. They want an entry barrier so that competition cannot enter, right? They want an innovative solution so that you can stay ahead of competition. They want enough traction, which means revenues going up and up and up every month. So what the investor wants and what the startup founder wants are exactly the same. It is the persistent model, right? And therefore, my recommendation and our recommendation, both me and my co-founder, to all of you guys out there who either have a startup or are planning to create a startup, try and evaluate your startup within this framework, right? Are you solving a problem? Do you have an earnings model? Is the size of the market large enough? Do you have entry barriers, etc., etc.? Because if you can, you know, evaluate your startup and you can tweak your business model so that you actually are within this framework, then your chances of success are higher and your chances of getting funding are also that much higher. All right. So I think with that, I will probably stop. And this is my last slide. So this is the book. This is the cover of the book. I must tell you, it's a very easy to read book. I don't. It's also a funny book. It's a kind of bedtime reading. Right. I don't write heavy books. I don't like heavy books. It's a kind of book you can take to bed with you. Right. So, so if you're interested, you can pick up a copy. It's available on Amazon. Right. So I think with that, Michael, I'll stop and I'll stop sharing my screen. And maybe this is a
Yeah.
good time to
Now we
stop
can.
and ask for questions.
Yeah, we can go into questions. Maybe before we go into that, maybe also for you guys to know, as we are streaming this live also on Facebook, on YouTube, in case somebody is watching and has questions, you can also ask where. I receive the comments. So just in case, you can also let me know where. I would have a question maybe to start off. First, very interesting framework, what you talked about here with persistent through AHA, from the problem, the earnings model, we go further, we kind of succeed through that. In your experience, where along this path do many startups or most startups have an issue or fail? Like where is like usually the issue with them? Do a lot of them start already with a problem, or is it like the earnings, or they cannot later scale? Where did you see a lot of issues coming up?
Okay. So I have seen, I think the largest number of situations I've seen where startups have failed. There are two broad areas, right? Many of them fail in many areas, but the two biggest areas, one of them is the founder. Uh, Maybe it's a single founder, maybe it is two founders, but they are not the right founders. I'll give you a very simple example, right? Um, I deal with a lot of startups which are founded by tech guys, right? They are brilliant at creating a technological solution, right? But they have no business sense. Now, the important thing in any startup is that you have to run a business. You're not running an R&D project, right? And I have seen startup founders who have fallen in love with their own product, and they've said, look, I mean, that's it. People will come on their own and buy. And I'll give you a very simple example. You must be aware of something like Citrix or VMware, right? That is basically trying to create a virtual desktop environment on the internet. Now, these are market leaders. This guy had created a much lower cost solution as opposed to Citrix and VMware, which are very, very expensive solutions. But he was very happy with that. He says, I'll keep improving that. Customers will come to me. I said, boss, you got to go out and sell. No, I don't think I need to sell. Customers will come to me. It failed. It obviously failed, right? So, one of the messages I have for guys who have a tech background, if you're a great techie, wonderful, but you also have to have business sense. And if you don't, please get a co-founder who has business sense. So you focus on maybe the development of the product and the other guy focuses on the business, right? So this is one place where a lot of people have failed. I think the other place where people have failed is they have not anticipated competition, and therefore they don't have enough of an entry barrier, right? And that's again a very, very common situation. For a founder, it is, see, he has a lot of faith in his own product. He believes there is no competition which is close to me. I think what is very important for any founder to do, and it is not easy to do this, but I think it's very important, put yourself in the shoes of a competitor and try and figure out how you can kill your business. Because if you can figure out how you can kill your business, then you will come back into your own shoes and figure out how you can save your business, right? Do not never underestimate competition. Competition can come in from anywhere. A very simple example, we have the biggest telephone network, sorry, the biggest mobile phone networks in India. One is Vodafone, right? That's one of the biggest. And the other big one is an Indian company called Airtel. They were sitting pretty. They had a duopoly, right? There were only two guys. Suddenly, the richest man in India, Mukesh Ambani, he came in, he created something called Jio. And he's just killing everybody, right? So a huge guy, entrenched guy like Airtel suddenly doesn't know what the hell to do. So please remember, competition can always come in. And you can always have competition who has more funds than you, and therefore he's able to give discounts which you might not be able to. Never underestimate them. Always try and look at it from the competitor's point of view. See how we can kill you. In fact, it's a very good idea. I normally suggest this to founders. Sit down with friends, right? Get into coffee discussion with friends. Tell them, boss, please tell me why my startup is going to fail. Give me 10 reasons why it will fail, and then figure out why it is going to succeed. Right. So I think these are two big reasons.
Very, very well. That's I can see this also very often. People having this idea: my product is the best. It's wonderful.
Yes.
I will get people to it. They forget what's actually happening out there when it comes to reality. Very interestingly, when it comes to the team, said that people not necessarily have enough diverse qualifications. In Germany, often it's kind of the other way. You have a team of just business people, but we don't have a techie. We're missing the tech guy. So we're gonna develop this beautiful, wonderful app and all this stuff, and when it's like, who? Yeah. Like, who of you guys is gonna do? That's kind of the opposite of it, but it's very interesting to see, definitely. I would also happy to go into questions from the audience. I think Shaimer, here had a question. Shaimer asked, at what stage to patent your startup idea? As you're sharing startup ideas with many people, how to secure it. And then, of course, also Shaima wrote, if we patent the startup, can competitors still act on the same idea as our own startup?
Okay. So first of all, you must remember, it's a good question, by the way, Shaima. And for this, I will send you one chocolate, right? Just give Michael your address and we will send you a chocolate. A big, huge slab of chocolate. Yeah. Okay. So, so first of all, you must remember ideas, quite honestly, ideas mean nothing, right? There are how many people are there in the world? 7 billion people in the world, right? Approximately. Everybody is churning out ideas every day. So if you have an idea, you can be absolutely sure within your country, outside your country, there'll be enough other people with a similar idea, right? So an idea by itself is meaningless. Right? What is important is how you put that idea into a business and actually execute it, which means using that idea, you build a product, whatever that product is. So for example, it could be the app that Aha Taxis created. You gather all these taxi guys together, etc., 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 right? So building, actually executing the startup is the most important thing, not the idea, right? That is number one. Number two, like I said very clearly, you have to have entry barriers. If you don't have entry barriers, the idea is copyable, right? It's highly copyable. Okay. So in case you want to get into a startup, you want to create a startup, please make sure that you have a strong entry barrier, because then you will be ahead of anybody else who tries to copy your idea. Okay, so that's important. So idea is nothing by itself. Build a business with a strong entry barrier. So our taxis, for example, now it has 40,000 taxi operators. It has it has a very good brand. And therefore, if a competitor wants to copy the idea, he will take a lot of time to build it up to the same stage, right? So our taxis is reasonably safe. The other question you asked was about patents, right? Um, a patent normally is something which you can defend, right? You can defend, which means if you have a patent and the other guy has copied it, you can defend it. But please remember one thing, defending a patent means you will have to go to court. And if you have to go to court, right, obviously you got to pay legal fees. Incidentally, I am very happy if somebody has to pay legal fees because my son is a lawyer. He stays 2 floors above me in the same house, and if somebody goes to court, I'll just attach him to you, right? But remember, for a startup, it is not always easy to pay those legal fees. So therefore, I would say a patent is a good thing to dissuade the competitor from coming in. But if it's a large competitor who wants to kill you and he tries to copy your patent, uh, quite frankly, unless you have the legal ability, the legal, you know, the well, you can pay the legal fees to fight that case. It's not going to be easy. So therefore, the only solution I would say is your entry barrier has to be a few years ahead, which means even if you've created a patented product, make sure the other guy takes 6 months to create the same product and keep improving your product. So he's always 6 months behind you. I think that's the practical point of view.
I think I see, Ashok, maybe you can write down your question into the chat. I see that you put up your hand, but I don't see a question yet, so we can take this up after you posted it. In the meanwhile, there's just a question from Adeni. Adeni just wrote, what is your view about single founders who try hard to find a co-founder, but cannot find and want to go ahead with a startup because the majority of angels always flag off single founders when raising funds?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's a very good question. And there are 2, 3 reasons why angel investors normally prefer at least 2 or 3 co-founders. One is that it cuts down the risk. If something unfortunately happens to one of the sole founder, the only founder, then the company shouldn't sink, right? The second thing is that normally 2 or 3 people bring different capabilities, different skills to the table, right? So one could be a techie, one could be a business guy, maybe one is a relationship guy, right? So they bring different capabilities to the table. If you are looking for a co-founder, first of all, I must tell you, it must be a co-founder that you trust. That's very, very, very important, because please remember, this is a lifetime commitment. It is not something which you're, it's not a girlfriend that you catch hold of for 2 months, and at the end of that you say, okay, bye bye. She says bye bye, and that's it. It's a lifetime commitment. It's a long commitment, right? You got to trust each other, otherwise you cannot work together. So it has to be somebody you trust. If you already have a friend or a contact who you can trust, wonderful. If you don't, one method I would suggest is catch hold of somebody, take him on right now as an employee. But potentially he may be a founder. Don't make him a co-founder yet. Over time, as you begin to trust him, as you realize that he's the right person, at that stage, bring him on as co-founder by giving him a bigger quantity of shares in your company. That is probably the only way. So I would say, never blindly go ahead with the co-founder. After you met him twice, please spend time with him so that you trust him and you know that the two of you can work closely together. That's very, very important.
Yeah, that's like I've seen this also a couple of times with people that if like the chemistry doesn't work out and suddenly the whole
Yes.
thing crashes, especially if already you guys have different shares, and you want to continue working on that, it might be difficult, because not
Absolutely.
everybody will be just like, okay, you could just continue on. They might be saying, yeah, what about my part?
It's
And when
just
you're
to
too
give you a
late,
parallel, Michael, it's like getting married. No?
yeah,
Man, woman,
you're
they like
married.
each other's face. They
You
met
cannot
each
just
other,
say
like each
leave.
other's face. That's not enough,
No.
because the face will disappear after a few years.
True, you need to love what's inside, what's in
Yes,
there,
I
not just the
know.
appearance.
Yeah.
There's another question from Shaima. If you could give some good examples of entry barriers.
Okay. Okay, good. So I gave you one example from AHA Taxis. Let me take one more example from, it's a very interesting case. This is a guy who, so by the way, technology, good use of technology, good use of things like machine learning is a very good entry barrier. Right? So I'll give you one example. There is a company that I have been involved in. It is called Uno Finance. Uno stands for first, right? Uno Finance. And they are into giving loans for hospitalization, right? See, the problem is when people are hospitalized, right? The risk is very high. The risk of, the patient not recovering or maybe losing his job and therefore not being able to pay back the loan. So, banks and other organizations like banks which give loans normally are reluctant to give loans to such people. Okay, they will only give loans to people who are getting hospitalized in very simple cases, very, very simple cases. Okay. For example, let us say somebody has a surgery where, uh, let's say, okay, I mean, let me take the example of my son. He had a he had a problem with his knee, and he had to have I forget what the name of the surgery was, but basically, the ligaments had got torn. So somewhere the ligaments had to be brought together, and he had to stay in hospital for 2 nights. Okay. Now that's a very low risk operation, very, very low risk operation. In fact, there is no risk to life at all, right? So for things like this, you will get a loan. Okay. So companies which give loans for things like this, there is no problem, because you know that the loan hopefully will be repaid back. But what these guys did was they said, we will now go one step beyond this. We will look at riskier loans as well. Okay. So, for example, what they did was they said, okay, we will have, they actually have a group of doctors who spend a lot of time researching medical journals, and they look at every kind of procedure. So let's say a cardiac, a heart bypass, right? Or angioplasty, which is ballooning of the blood vessels, right? So they look at every surgical, every hospital procedure and try and understand what the risks involved are, first of all, right? Secondly, so there is a huge amount of data which comes in from research journals. Secondly, um, what they also do is they say, okay, we will now also look at each hospital. So, for example, in India, there are, let's say in Delhi, there is a Max hospital, there is a Fortis hospital, there is a Apollo hospital, right? We will look at each hospital, we will look at each individual doctor within that hospital, and we will look at his track record, all right, and see what his track record has been in treating this particular disease. Okay, then we will look at each hospital. What is the kind of equipment that this hospital has, and therefore what is the track record of the hospital in treating this disease? So they pick up a lot of data, right? Now, because they pick up a lot of data, they can figure out, look, this patient is going in for, Dr. Smith in Apollo Hospital for, let's say, angioplasty, and therefore the risk is only about 30%. So I'm willing to give a loan, but the interest rate on the loan is going to be a little higher. Okay. The reason why they're able to do this is that they've collected a huge amount of data. A, from research journals, B, about hospitals, C, about doctors. And as they proceed, as they go along, as more and more patients get treated, every patient, they get more data, right? Because they know what happened to that patient, who the doctor was, which the hospital was. So their data actually keeps improving constantly. Now, this data is analyzed using machine learning. And that machine learning is what tells you what the probability of recovery of the patient is going to be. Okay. Now, please remember, machine learning works best when you have a lot of data. As these guys grow, they will have more and more data. So any competitor who wants to get into the same field immediately cannot compete with them because he doesn't have this data. And let's say 1 year later, he catches up with them. But 1 year later, this company, Uno Finance, will be another year ahead because they've got even more data. Correct? So that's a very good example of an entry barrier where you use the fact that you're growing and you use the fact that you're building up more and more data to beat the competitor. The other very simple example is, a guy like WhatsApp. So for example, in India, WhatsApp is not the best instant messaging app that there is. There are many others, right? But why do people get onto WhatsApp? Because I know my friends will be there. I don't want to get onto a instant messaging app where I don't have any friends. Why would I be there, right? So the larger the number of people you have, the bigger the entry barrier, because everybody now wants to come to you and not to the other guy. TikTok, very simple example. Why do people go there? Because that has the largest number of viewers, isn't it? The Chinese app. So entry barrier is something which normally gets built over time. Incidentally, if you have a strong product, software product, hardware product, whatever, that's a good entry barrier because it'll take the other guy that much more time to build it.
That's a very good point. Definitely, you need some time to build it, make these barriers, and that can be a good approach. As we're kind of slowly coming to the end from the time, there were two open questions. So one is basically just a one-liner. What does N stands for and persistent? That was the niche. Have like your niche, as Mr. Andrunat already mentioned out with AHA taxis, that we take like your sub-segment when taking these travels between cities. So that's, I think, quickly answered. Maybe as this last question, just quickly, from Pramit. What's the top tip to evaluate an angel investor? Like, what should people look into? Say, let's say, Dhruv, are you the right investor for me or not?
Oh, okay. Very good. Wonderful. Wonderful. Perfect. Good question. Who asked that? Pramit. Pramit, where are you?
Pramit,
where are you? Hyderabad.
Hyderabad, yeah.
Good. So I will send you a chocolate. Okay. So by the way, in case people want to give to buy the book, Michael, I think what you have given is the address of the URL.
Yeah, from Amazon.
Amazon Germany, right?
I think we're saying, but yeah, let me think. We sent a different one. Sorry, yeah. I just look the other link.
So I can also send people the link for Amazon India. I'll send it to you and you can forward it to these guys, right?
Yeah, I have it. I'm forwarding that into the chat.
Okay, fine. Okay. So, Pramit, that's a very, very important question. In fact, we have a saying in our investment circles: who you take the money from is probably more important than the money itself. I'll tell you why. You want an angel investor or you want an investor who thinks like you. So you need time to build up your business. You have a vision for the business, right? The investor should think like you. He also believes, yes, it will take you 4 or 5 years, and he's not going to pressurize you. Unfortunately, there are many investors who say, boss, I put in money. It's now 1 year since I put in money. Where is my exit? I want my returns, right? Now, you cannot operate under that kind of pressure. You can't. So what is very important is, you, just as the investor needs to spend time with you also need to spend time with the investor to figure out whether he is, this kind of the guy who's going to pressurize you every quarter to give you an exit. Fortunately, angel investors, fortunately, most of them realize that it takes time for a startup to build up, and therefore they will not pressurize you like this. So that is one part. Second, very important. Ideally, you should have some investors who can add value to your startup, right? What kind of value? Number one, if they come from the same industry as you, they will probably be able to mentor you. They'll be able to give you good advice, right? So, for example, I spend a lot of time mentoring young startups, right? And it's great. It's great learning for me, and hopefully it helps the startup as well. So, try and get an investor who is within your area. Number one. Number two, if the investor has contacts, which most senior investors would, you can use those contacts, right? Potentially they are your customers, right? Or they are your partners. But you must remember, normally, if you're looking for an angel investor, you will never approach an angel directly. You will normally approach an angel network, which has a group of angel investors, right? So, for example, in India, I am a part of Lead Angels Network, LEAD, Lead Angels Network. And you can check up our URL on the website. Just go there, apply, and then you're in touch with the angel network, and therefore we have about 200 angel investors. Potentially, you can present to all of them, and all of them are potential investors in your company, right? So normally, it's going to be very difficult for one guy, one founder, to approach all angels. You can't. For example, in India, there are probably about 30,000 angels. How do you know where they are? You don't know them, right? So therefore, approach an angel network, and through them you will get their members. And most angel networks will have something like 2 to 300, 400 kind of members.
Well, thank you, Drew, for these very insightful kind of like experiences, the insights onto the startup journey. I think like a lot of founders can learn a lot of that. First, again, thank you for taking the time, answering questions. I'd recommend you all check out his book. I just sent the link here. Also, Funding Your Startup and Other Nightmares. I would definitely recommend it to buy it and get it.
Okay.
And
Michael, sorry, Michael, if I can interrupt for a minute, Shaima has just asked a question. Maybe I'll just quickly take it up.
Yeah, then just very quickly, because we have to kind of come to an end. But yeah, let's just do it very quickly then.
Shaima, initially, when you get funding, initially you will have your own sources, or you will go to friends and family, right? But the first external investors you normally go to are angels, and angels normally fund up to, roughly, I'm talking about the Indian environment, it'll probably vary a little. They will normally fund up to about $500,000. I don't know what it is in Europe and the US, but roughly that's the range. The VC comes in later. The VC normally funds much bigger amounts, but at a later stage. So initially, if you need funding, you will go to angels. Crowdfunding is a very different option. By the way, crowdfunding is not valid in India, but it's valid in some Western countries. Typically, crowdfunding is where you get lots and lots of guys to put in small amounts. But normally, the amounts you can raise through crowdfunding, normally, there are exceptions, is not very high. So I would suggest, if you're actually looking at a good startup, it is probably best to look at an angel network. That is your first starting point.
Yeah, and also Shaima, if like you have more questions, other people, always happy to bring them up to Dhruv on DoDash, on his LinkedIn. Definitely, as I mentioned before, have a look at his book. Get yourself a copy, because I think that will definitely help yourself on the journey. If you joined later,
and for this, Michael, I will send you a chocolate.
Thank you. Always happy for some chocolates. German chocolate, even. Oh, I don't mind Indian chocolate. It's also good.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, if you missed parts of the session or want to rewatch it, we have recorded the session. We'll upload it on DoDash. We also streamed it, as I mentioned, on Facebook, on YouTube, where you can see it. So if you missed anything, just rewatch it. And otherwise, if you're not part of DoDash yet, please join our community. Learn all about it. If you need help with validation, finding your co-founder, starting your business, or getting to investments, we are here to help you. Thank you again, Drew, for your time. I think it was a very great and insightful session. And yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much. And by the way, Shaima has one last comment where she says, please do send me the chocolate.
Everybody gets chocolates and cookies. Fantastic. Well, thank you for your time again, Dhruv.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining, and see you guys on Dudashwan.
Ashok also wants a chocolate. Sure, everybody gets a chocolate.
Everybody get chocolate.
Thank you.
Right,
Bye-bye.
Bye.